No, hey, look, the coup took place in West Africa and overthrew the government. I am so shocked right now. Yeah, as the meme goes, my friends.
Ah, here we go again.
Yeah, if the sarcasm was not caught by now, I genuinely cannot help you. I sound like a broken record on this channel talking about all these different coups, counter coups, and more that have been taking place in Africa over the past 2 years. In this case, though, we will be talking about a country that I have never actually spoken about here before, Guinea Bissau. What do you think, Moonbeam? Are you going to lead the next coup? Yeah? Oh, wait, no, now Melly is coming over here. Hello! Yeah, if you see the little head in here, I'm being swarmed by animals that all appear to want to take place in a violent government overthrow. I say violent, but that's not exactly how all this went down. This particular coup in question in Guinea-Bissau would take place on the 26th November 2025, led by Brigadier General Dinis Nkanha, the head of the military office of the presidency. The military officers would go and declare total control over the country and would establish the High Military Command for the Restoration of National Security and Public Order, led by General Horta Inta A Naman, or Naman. I genuinely do not know how it is that I'm actually supposed to pronounce this guy's name. Either way, this event was part of a series of political and military tensions that have been building in the country over the course of many years. This is not something that was just oh, what a surprise. We definitely didn't expect anything like this to happen. And you'll see why I am mentioning that. Because, of course, the immediate question that a lot of people are going to have is, okay, well, why did this happen, though? The immediate trigger for the coup was the recent presidential election held on November 23rd, 2025. The military would claim that the takeover was necessary, and it was necessary in order to thwart a plot involving politicians and drug barons, alleging an attempt to manipulate the vote, which, wow, okay, that is a claim. However, independent election observers reported that there was no real evidence of rigging, describing the election as very well managed and conducted properly. So, again, why? Well, and oh boy, well, that is where a potential conspiracy comes in. And when I say that, I'm not supporting this theory, mind you. Everything is up in the air right now, as news is fresh, but some believe that this whole thing may have just been an inside job and the coup a sham. The opposition and civil society groups in Guinea-Bissau would go and accuse President Umaro Sissoco Embaló of staging a simulated coup in order to prevent the release of election results and remain in power. This accusation stems from Embaló's earlier statements that he would not seek a second term, despite his legitimacy being questioned by the opposition, who claimed that his term should have ended in February of 2025. Yeah, so he went back on that, ran anyway, was apparently not supposed to be doing it, and then on top of all that, may have lost and decided to say screw it and rig the whole thing. So, is the whole thing fake then? Well, it is actually a possibility. Most things are, but there is no real way to tell yet. The only thing that we can do is tell you the context and the story that led to this point, and unless some new information comes out, you can decide for yourself. It honestly would not surprise me, though, because holy crap, guys, Guinea-Bissau is unstable. This would not surprise me. Since independence from Portugal in 1974, Guinea-Bissau has had, counting this one that just occurred, at least 10 attempted coups or coups, and only a single democratically elected president has ever completed a full term in office. So, yeah, sit back, relax, and let's look into the train wreck that is yet another coup-wrecked state on the African continent. Also, speaking of political instability as well as crisis, if you want to join us in a milsim of the 13th century War of the Barons, which is a LARP, we are going to be doing that here this February, and I'm currently recruiting men for my faction, the Neutrals, as well as the other factions if you want to fight with or against me, depending on what you want to do. I'm going to throw up some pictures right here, but I'm bringing my editor along, so I'm sure he's going to put some stuff in this as well. But it's literally going to be a couple hundred of us out in the woods this February fighting each other for 3 days. So if you want to join us, it's going to be an absolute blast. That is my shield for my barony. This is my helmet. Does this not look freaking awesome? Yeah, we're looking to recruit as many men as we possibly can in order to fill out the neutral faction, because we are basically the mercenaries that are going to be trying to destabilize the region as much as possible. You have the loyalists that are supporting the king, you have the rebels that are rebelling against the king, and then the neutrals, we are the mercs that can take either side depending upon what it is that we get paid, and from there, we try and keep the conflict going as long as possible. Gee, it sounds actually very fitting considering all the countries that I talk about here on this channel. Anyway, link for that is down in the description, so you should definitely go out and join us. It's going to be a blast, I'm telling you this right now. But we need to get back to the story. But my friends, before we continue today's video, I would like to thank today's sponsor, Aura. Now, for those of you who've been watching my videos here for a while, you may be familiar with Aura already, as they're one of the long-term sponsors of this channel, and it's important because in the modern day and age when information is quite literally power, information on you is very easily able to get into the wrong hands. Unfortunately, in the modern day and age, we put our information into so many different sites all the time. Whether you are doing things for shopping, whether you're doing things for school, or anything like that, your information is out there and leaks will happen. Which is awful, of course, but that is exactly where Aura comes in. Because what Aura does is it takes care of the hard part, automatically removing your info from these sites and keeping it off. Yes, there are a lot of other services that do things like this as well, but none of them offer nearly as many features as what Aura does. Aura will get you alerts if your personal info is found on the dark web. It provides real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 monitoring to help keep your identity secure, a secure VPN, antivirus, and password manager, and more. And if anything does happen and your identity somehow still does get stolen, Aura provides up to $5 million in identity theft protection insurance. I am serious when I say that as time goes on and our information goes into more and more things, a service like Aura is something that is going to become not just nice, but a necessity. And so I'm telling you this right now. If you want to try it for yourself, go and click the link down in my description, go to aura.com/history of everything, and you can try the service free for 14 days. Thank you to Aura for sponsoring this video. And with that, my friends, back to the show. To summarize very quickly, Guinea-Bissau's history is a story of fierce anti-colonial struggle, high hopes for a socialist utopia, as many African nations had, and a subsequent, seemingly endless spiral of military coups, political assassinations, and chronic instability. That is the quick summary. That is literally just, if you wanted to sum up a country, unfortunately, that is its entire history. But to explain that more, though, we have to go back into its past. To begin, before European arrival, the region that is now Guinea-Bissau was part of the Kabu Kingdom, a Mandinka empire that had broken away from the Mali Empire. The area was ethnically diverse, home to groups like the Balanta, the Fula, the Manjak, and different other organizations and societies, organized in smaller, decentralized kingdoms and chiefdoms. To the Portuguese, though, the coast was known as the Costa dos Escravos, which, I'm not kidding when I say this, literally was the coast of slaves, due to its early and significant role in the transatlantic slave trade, which is something that would permanently alter the region's demographics and political landscape forevermore. The Portuguese were, in fact, the first Europeans to arrive, and they would establish trading posts and forts from the early 15th century onwards. Now, unlike other European powers who focused on large-scale territorial control, the Portuguese presence in Guinea-Bissau was, for centuries, limited to small coastal enclaves. They were primarily interested in the slave trade and later in cash crops like peanuts, palm oil, rubber, etc., which is what we would largely see being produced later on. Moving on from that, though, because it's not necessarily as relevant, efforts to expand inland in the 19th century would be met with fierce resistance from local populations, especially the Papel people and the warriors of the Cabo Kingdom. It was only in the early 20th century that Portugal managed to subdue the interior, establishing the colony of Portuguese Guinea. From there, colonial rule would be characterized by neglect, essentially, using local chiefs to run things. It would also be characterized by forced labor and virtually no investment in education, infrastructure, or anything for the indigenous population. This colony existed for one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to extract as many resources out of it as possible. That's it. This, of course, created deep-seated grievances that would fuel the independence movement that would come later, which is exactly where we are going next. During World War II, many Africans would gain military and political experience while fighting with and for the colonial powers. In the wake of the war came the emergence of African nationalist movements, and from that, by the early 1960s, most Western African countries had achieved independence through protest, petition, demonstration, and other largely peaceful means, which, again, we have spoken about a number of times already when speaking about the other African nations here that have had their own crises. But Guinea-Bissau was going to be a bit different. To avoid criticism of its colonial policies in Africa, in 1951, the Portuguese had redefined their colony status to that of overseas provinces. The African population of Guinea-Bissau did not perceive these changes as meaningful because it didn't really do anything, just kept the same status quo. and some members of the colonial population began to agitate for complete independence from Portugal for both Guinea Bissau and Cape Verde. From this, we would see in the mid 20th century the rise of the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, or the PAIGC, founded in 1956 by the charismatic revolutionary Amilcar Cabral and his brother Louis Cabral, along with Aristides Pereira. Now, these three individuals are very important, but arguably the most important among them were the Cabral brothers, because Amilcar, an agronomist and intellectual, would go and fuse Marxist-Leninist ideology with local culture, which would create a powerful liberation movement. But it wasn't quite there yet. At first, the PAIGC's goal was to achieve independence through peaceful means. Protest, that sort of thing. However, in August of 1959, the Portuguese would respond to a dock workers' strike with intense violence, killing and wounding numerous demonstrators, which would convince the PAIGC that really the only way to gain independence properly would be a rurally based armed struggle. After a period of military training and political preparation, the PAIGC would launch its armed campaign in January of 1963, and from there, the war was on. Now, my friends, to describe this whole thing as unpleasant would be an understatement. The Guinea-Bissau War of Independence would last all the way from 1963 to 1974, 11 years, and was one of the most successful, but also brutal, anti-colonial wars in Africa. Cabral's forces, with crucial support from Cuba, the Soviet Union, and other socialist nations, would use guerrilla warfare to gradually seize control of vast swaths of the countryside. By 1972, the PAIGC had declared independence of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau and was functioning as a de facto state with its own schools, hospitals, and embassies. It was working, but tragically, Amilcar Cabral was assassinated on January 20th, 1973, in a plot that is believed to have involved Portuguese agents with the complicity of disaffected PAIGC members. His death was a devastating blow to the overall movement, but it is something that would continue under the leadership of his brother, Louis Cabral, and that is a good thing because massive changes were about to come in rapid order. Following the April 1974 Carnation Revolution in Portugal, which overthrew the fascist dictatorship that controlled it, Portugal would abruptly withdraw from its colonies. Guinea-Bissau was formally recognized as an independent nation on September 10th, 1974, and just like that, it was free. Okay, awesome. Well, now what? Well, Louis Cabral, again, the brother of Amilcar Cabral, would become the first president of independent Guinea-Bissau. His presidency was marked by efforts to rebuild the country after the war and would establish a socialist state as well as unifying with Cape Verde. The PAIGC that we spoke about here before, that was now the ruling party, and it would go and implement policies aimed at national reconstruction, land reform, and the development of education and healthcare, which, okay, good. But that being said, they were going to do it without anyone questioning them. Political freedoms were limited, and the country was declared to be a one-party state. Because yay, freedom under Marxism. Funny how that works out. Yes, my friends, the immediate post-independence period would see significant economic and social challenges. The country was severely underdeveloped, with limited infrastructure and a largely agrarian economy. The war had devastated the country, and the new government faced the daunting task of rebuilding while also dealing with the legacy of colonial exploitation and forced labor. The economy was, again, primarily based on cash crops, things like palm oil, peanuts, and rubber, which were exported to generate revenue. However, the lack of diversification and the reliance of a few export commodities made the economy extremely vulnerable to global market fluctuations. So yeah, not great. One of the key focuses of Louis Cabral's government was the development of education and healthcare. The government would implement programs to increase literacy rates and improve access to healthcare, especially in rural areas. Which is nice. These efforts were aimed at empowering the population and reducing dependence on foreign aid. But the issue is, with limited resources and ongoing challenges of reconstruction, as well as terrible corruption, this would hinder the full realization of these goals. State-planned economies, generally kind of suck. That is just a reality of history. And so it is here then that the coups start rolling in. Are you ready? because this was very important that we establish the background leading to all of this. On November 14th, 1980, Prime Minister João Bernardo Nino Vieira, who I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of here in the first place, a war hero, he led a bloodless coup that would oust Louis Cabral, who was charged with abuse of power and initially was sentenced to death by the new forces. But after negotiations, Cabral was released from that sentence and went into exile. The coup would end the plans for unification with Cape Verde, and from there would usher in a new era of military-dominated rule. And that is pretty much how things were going to go for the next 45 years. With his ascent to power, Vieira would face a series of difficult political and economic problems. Guinea Bissau's poverty would require development aid from Portugal, which in turn would seek to restore its economic relations with Guinea Bissau. In addition, the poorly performing state-planned economic policy that had been adopted from independence was increasingly seen as not viable and would have to be liberalized in subsequent years as attempts were made to improve the economy by privatizing state-owned enterprises. Which is something, normally, that can help, but the shift towards a free market economy was not universally embraced, and it became a source of political unrest as corruption continued to run rampant and inequality would increase along with greater wealth being produced. So yes, more wealth was coming into the country, but it wasn't exactly being distributed evenly. Still, the country was ready to move forward, and like much of Africa over the course of the 1990s, Guinea-Bissau would make the transition to a democratic, multi-party system, and the country's first free legislative and presidential elections would be held in 1994. As you could probably still expect, the PAIGC would win a majority of legislative seats, while Vieira would narrowly win his own race, becoming the first elected president of the country in an election that, generally speaking, was considered free and fair. So, okay, awesome, right? Free elections. Sweet, but what about the coups, you may wonder? Like Stack, you said that it would start a series of them. And yes, that is exactly right. This period of relative peace and democracy was not going to last. You see, my friends, after nearly 2 decades in power, Vieira's rule was increasingly seen as corrupt and authoritarian, but that is pretty much the way that it had always been. The spark for change, though, was Vieira's dismissal of the highly respected Armed Forces Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Ousmane Mane, on suspicion of smuggling weapons to Senegalese rebels. Mane, who had been a key figure in the 1980 coup, had immense support from within the military ranks. So, as a result of this, he would launch a rebellion that quickly escalated into a full-blown civil war. The conflict would last nearly a year, devastating the capital of Bissau, and would displace over a third of the entire population. Now, most observers first thought that mutineers would eventually tire, and that Vieira would reemerge as the victor. But instead, the conflict would broaden, and various ceasefires would be called and broken, with troops from Guinea, Nigeria, Senegal, and even France going and intervening. But after each round of fighting, Vieira would become increasingly isolated within Bissau, and ultimately, in May of 1999, he was forced to surrender and later went into exile in Portugal. From this, Mane would rise to power. A military junta would be formed, and that would oversee a transition to elections, which would bring former opposition leader Kumba Yala to power. If anything, this event would completely shatter the illusion of civilian supremacy and would demonstrate the military's capacity to defeat an incumbent president in open warfare as just a viable means to change. And guess what? That is going to become a lot more relevant extremely quickly. Despite a overall fairly democratic beginning, Yala's rule would become increasingly repressive over time. His rule was erratic and authoritarian. He dissolved parliament, he dismissed judges, he failed to pay civil servants and soldiers for months on end, which, as you can imagine, is not going to make him a very popular figure. The country was in a state of complete political and economic paralysis, and aid from the IMF was suspended. Which is awful, yeah, but the funniest part about this entire thing? Yala's relationship with General Ousmane Mane, the guy who was the leader of the rebellion that had toppled Vieira's government over the course of the Civil War from 1998 to 99 and put Yala in charge in the first place. That relationship was very difficult. Yala attempted to promote a number of military officers in November of 2000, but Mane said that his list of promotions was not the one that Yala had previously agreed to with Mane. And so, as a result of this, Mane announced that he was taking control of the armed forces, revoking Yala's promotions and replacing the chief of staff, a guy by the name of Verissimo Correa Sibra, and the government took offense to this. An outbreak of fighting would follow, and Mane would ultimately get killed in a clash with government forces a week later on the 30th of November. It was, in general, a massive, embarrassing affair, and Yala's presidency overall was a disaster. It's just complete disaster. I am not even explaining half of the things that this guy did, but we have to move on, and something had to change. Thus, another coup would take place in September of 2003. This one, led by General Verissimo Correa Sibra, the guy who we literally just mentioned here, that armed forces chief of staff who had been a key figure in Mane's 1998 rebellion, he would launch this one. And the coup was swift, it was bloodless, and it was honestly almost welcomed by a population that was exhausted by Yala's misrule. The military would seize the presidential palace and place Yala under house arrest, citing the need to avoid chaos and anarchy. Which, okay, yeah, sure, but normally the international community is not necessarily pleased by such events occurring. Not this time, though. The coup was widely accepted by the international community as a necessity in order to prevent state collapse. And the military, from this, would quickly install a civilian caretaker government, which would oversee new elections in 2005. And now, my friends, I just have to go ahead and say this. This is genuinely surprising how we have now had, at this point, multiple cases of the military overthrowing the government and then willingly giving up power to another democratic process. Because usually in these kinds of stories, when we're talking about these subjects, there's a bit more trouble with that taking place. Also, equally, if not more surprising, was that in a stunning turn of events, the winner of those elections was, drumroll please, the exiled former leader, Nino Vieira. That's right, he's back, baby. Sorry guys, Moonbeam was upset that she was not part of the election and now she's demanding attention. But genuinely, my friends, I have to explain this part just a bit because I swear this is almost laughable. No, in fact, it is this is extremely laughable. In March of 2005, Yala, the guy that got couped and kicked out of office, announced his intention to contest the election scheduled for June of that year. Although both he and Vieira, our other guy that got couped and kicked out of office, had both been barred from politics in 2003. Both candidates were subsequently cleared to run for office in April. And the following month, Yala would go and announce that, no, he wasn't running for election because guess what? In fact, he was still president and he staged a brief occupation of the presidential building. Dear God, it never ends. But still, things didn't exactly work out for him. Defeated in the first round of polling, he would eventually go and back Vieira, who won a second round of elections held in July. Although supporters of the opposition would raise allegations of fraud, the elections were declared by the international observers to have been free and fair, and lo and behold, we got a new president who was the old president that got couped. Fun times. Yes, my friends, this entire mess was extremely chaotic, and it is here that we really need to stress just how fragile the country was, and still is to this day. Ongoing political strife and economic challenges were being compounded by drug smuggling, an increasing problem for Guinea Bissau and other Western African countries over the course of the mid-2000s. With a geography that was favorable to smuggling and an inability to adequately protect the coastline and airspace, Guinea Bissau was a especially desirable target, and individuals in the upper echelons of the government, the military, and other sectors were allegedly involved in drug trafficking. People talk about how cartels control Mexico and its government, but Guinea-Bissau is arguably the Mexico of Africa, and that is saying something. And of course, you can't have Mexico without political assassinations and drug trafficking, which we actually covered in our episode here on Mexico this past week, so you should definitely go and check that out. But I mention these things because that is where our story is going. You see, Vieira's second term was plagued with instability and intense rivalry with the military, especially with his own army chief of staff, General Batista Tagame Nawaye. The country, overall, was now a major hub for cocaine trafficking, and state institutions were deeply infiltrated by competing narco factions. Because of this, violence would sporadically break out in different sectors of the country. In fact, rebellious soldiers would attack Vieira's home in the early hours of the 23rd of November 2008, shortly after the November 2008 parliamentary elections in which the PAIGC won a majority of seats. The soldiers would fire artillery at the house and were able to enter it during a 3-hour battle with Vieira's guards. But they were repelled before it is they could reach Vieira, who was unharmed and subsequently would accuse General Batista of attempting a hit or coup. So yeah, he survived, at least initially, but that was not something that was going to last. Because you see, my friends, the hatred and rivalry between Vieira and General Batista was going to continue, with Batista reportedly even surviving an assassination attempt in January of 2009. This being when a militia that was assigned to the presidential palace would open fire on his staff car. Of course, the militia denied that this had been an assassination attempt, but a few months later, Batista would be killed by an explosion in his office, possibly from an RPG round being fired into it. The result? Soldiers that were loyal to him went and stormed the private residence of the president, beating him, hacking him with machetes, and then shooting him to death. So yeah, okay, wow, yeah, that happened. Yeah, all right then. But I need to go ahead and stress this right now when I'm telling the story. This wasn't a coup, or at least it wasn't a classic coup where power gets immediately seized. This was more of a targeted political assassination that amounted to the decapitation of the state. The military did not, technically speaking, take formal control of the country, but instead would oversee a constitutional transition to an interim government. This event would cement the terrifying reality that political rivalries at the top of the military and government could be settled with extreme violence instead of dialogue, and that is the way that things would remain. Of course, the military would deny any intention to seize power, and under the terms of the Constitution, parliamentary leader Raimundo Pereira was sworn in to serve as interim president until elections could be held. These would eventually be scheduled for June 28th. But in a wild turn of events that you wouldn't expect, of course, on June 5th, only 3 weeks before the election, military authorities would go and kill presidential candidate Basira Dabo, the former defense minister Helder Proença, and former prime minister Faustino Mbali, and others, alleging that all of these guys were part of a group planning to overthrow the current government. Many senior PAIGC members were also detained as part of the operation to foil the alleged coup. This was absolutely crazy, but the tension and uncertainty surrounding the alleged coup and the military's response to it did not end up ultimately interfering with the scheduled presidential election, which would still proceed as planned on June 28th. None of the 11 candidates, though, that were running were able to obtain a majority of votes. So, election officials would announce that the two frontrunners, the PAIGC's Malam Basai Sanha, who once briefly served as interim president, and former president Kumbala Yala, would face off each other in a runoff election. In the second round of voting, held on July 26, 2009, Sanha was ultimately victorious, receiving more than 3/5 of the vote. So okay, awesome, new president. Does it get better from there? More stable? More secure? No, not really. Throughout his presidency, Sanha was plagued by poor health and did not initiate much meaningful change in the unstable country. A short-lived military uprising would occur in April of 2010, led by Deputy Chief of Staff Major General Antonio Njai and former Naval Chief Rear Admiral Jose Americo Bubonachuto, who had been involved in a previous coup attempt and was one of the country's high-ranking officials allegedly involved in drug trafficking. Absolutely wild, but it didn't work. Amazingly, though, in October of 2010, Sanha would surprise many with his decision to reinstate Nachuto as naval chief, which seems odd. Why would you reinstate the guy who had just tried to overthrow your government? I don't really get it. But do you think that this was something that was repaid with loyalty? No, of course not. Why would you think that? On December 26, 2011, while Sanha was out of the country for medical reasons, an apparent coup attempt was quickly put down. The alleged mastermind behind the plot was Nachuto. He was one of many people arrested for suspected involvement with the coup. And while the aftermath of the attempted coup was still being dealt with, on January 9, 2012, the government would announce that Sanha had died in Paris while seeking treatment. As a result, Pereira would once again serve as interim president until a new guy could be elected. I swear, this whole thing, it sounds so stupid. It sounds like this is out of a telenovela. But no, actually, this whole thing might just be an African telenovela. And it's going to continue with these plot points shortly after, because we would see, are you ready for it? Yet another coup during the election process of 2012. Amazing. For context, the country was preparing for a presidential runoff election after the first round between Prime Minister Carlos Gomez Jr. and former President Kumba Yala. Gomez Jr. was deeply unpopular with the military high command, who accused him of planning to clean up the armed forces by downsizing them, and also it seems they likely feared that he would disrupt their drug trafficking operations, which were allegedly ongoing. And so, led by the head of the army, General Antonio Njai, and other top military commanders, soldiers would go and storm the presidential palace, arresting Gomez Jr. and seizing key government buildings. The coup leaders would then announce the dissolution of all existing government institutions. Because of course this happens, why would this not happen? The coup, as a result, would successfully derail the democratic process. General Njai would become the undisputed strongman of the country, and that is possibly the way that things would have remained, but under international pressure, the military would agree eventually to oversee a transition to civilian rule. But still, the coup would demonstrate that the military was not going to tolerate a civilian leader that it perceived as a threat to their interests. And that is going to become even more relevant. Ultimately, elections would not take place until 2014 due to a series of stalls in the democratic process. When they finally occurred on April 13th, 2014, the PAIGC would make a strong showing. The party would win slightly more than half of the legislative seats, and its presidential candidate, former finance minister, Jose Mario Vaz, would win the presidency. And really, my friends, here, that is kind of where things get a little bit mixed. On one hand, Vaz is the only president in Guinea-Bissau's entire history to complete his full elected term, this being from 2014 to 2019. Which, hey, you know what? Great for him. Awesome. On the other hand, Vaz's term would see much political turmoil, which included a lengthy power struggle between him and others in the PAIGC, more than half a dozen different prime ministers in 5 years, and a parliament that was unable to really do anything. So it was 5 years of a whole lot of crap. Does it get better from there then? Not really. Parliamentary elections held in March of 2019 would see the PAIGC taking more seats than any other party. The first round of the presidential election, though, was held on November 24th, 2019. In this, you had former Prime Minister Domingos Simões Pereira representing the PAIGC, and along with that, Umaro Sissoco Embaló representing the Movement for Democratic Alteration Group of 15, or Mandem G15, opposition party, something that had been founded by former PAIGC members. These two were the two top vote getters, with the final winner of the presidential election being Embaló of the opposition. And so right now, my friends, I need to stress this. The parliament of the country was overwhelmingly PAIGC, while the president was a member of the opposition. That did not exactly go over well. Pereira and the PAIGC would voice allegations of fraud and filed complaints with the Supreme Court. One, filed on February 26, 2020, was still pending when Embaló held his own inauguration ceremony on February 27th. Now, the legality of Embaló's inauguration was disputed by Pereira and the PAIGC because of the pending case with the Supreme Court, and Gomez would reject his dismissal as being unlawful. Meanwhile, the PAIGC would dominate Parliament, the National People's Assembly, and it did not recognize Embaló's presidency. On February 28th, they would swear in Cipriano Casema, the Speaker of Parliament, to serve as interim president instead, which, from that, left the country with two rival administrations and a worsening political crisis. As you can imagine, this was bad, and it could have turned extremely bad extremely fast. But, luckily, Casema would quickly resign on March 1st, saying that his life had been threatened and he cited the risk of civil war within the country, something that they wished to avoid. Along with this, the Supreme Court would dismiss the petition from the PAIGC, and Embaló was ultimately confirmed as the president, thus finally ending the crisis. Still, despite the immediate relief, things were quite tense. And this is the way that things would remain going into 2022, when on February 1st of that year, Embaló and his government were reportedly targeted for assassination. Although the coup would ultimately fail, 11 people still ended up getting killed, and it was not immediately clear who was behind the attempt. You may think, oh, well, it was probably the military, but Embaló would even come out and state that the Bissau-Guinean military was not involved. Instead, it was related to drug trafficking. So, okay, now what? Well, we are finally reaching the end of our story as things head into the current day. Tensions would continue to mount in the country, especially after June of 2023 in the parliamentary elections, in which Embaló's coalition was unable to win a majority from the PAIGC and its allied parties, meaning there would still be a hamstrung minority party president. And this is something that would only get worse. In December, following a clash between military factions, Embaló would go and dissolve the National People's Assembly. He justified his action by claiming that the skirmish had been an attempted coup, and said that fresh elections would need to be held. These were later scheduled for November of 2024. But they would not end up happening. Political uncertainty would continue later that year when the promised elections were postponed, and it would persist into 2025 when the PAIGC and others held that Embaló's term had actually expired in February, and from that, they did not recognize his legitimacy as president after that point. The Supreme Court, however, would rule that Embaló's term was actually going to end in September of that year, because that would be 5 years after the court had recognized his victory in the contested 2019 election. Oh dear God, this is messy. It is extremely messy, and the amount of political fighting and backstabbing in this is insane. But it is here, my friends, that we finally arrive at the latest elections, and at the same time, the latest coup that spawned this video in the first place. Going back a little bit of time, in February of 2025, it was announced that both presidential and legislative elections were going to be held that year in November. Though Embaló had previously stated that he was not going to run for president, he, for some reason, went and changed his mind, declaring his candidacy in March, which pissed a lot of people off. Pereira, his main rival, was also barred from running for president, which further angered the majority party heading into the elections. As a result of this, since he could not run, Pereira and the PAIGC would instead endorse Fernando Dias of the Party for Social Renewal. And from there, things were getting a bit concerning. Alarms were being raised in late October when military leadership revealed that several senior officers had been arrested on suspicion of plotting a coup and interrupting the upcoming election. But despite this, Election Day proceeded as planned, with no real apparent issues, surprisingly enough. The only major issue was Pereira and Embaló would each claim victory the next day, even though provisional results were not due to be released until November 27th. That wasn't going to happen, though. On November 26th, 2025, the military would seize power in a coup. A military spokesperson would come out and announce that they had uncovered a plot to manipulate the election results, and thus they had suspended the electoral process and state institutions. Embaló was arrested, as were Dias and Pereira, and that was that. The next day, the military would go and announce that there was going to be a 1-year transitional period and installed General Horta Ndenaman as president of the transitional administration. Once again, we have the military in charge. But what about that conspiracy? Well, some in Guinea Bissau, including Dias, would allege that the coup was not genuine. It was actually a ploy by Embaló that had struck a deal with the military in order to be able to position himself to remain in power even if he had not won the November poll, and that in the aftermath of the coup, he was simply going to call for new elections in which he would again be a candidate, and from that, get a second chance at running. Like, it sounds kind of crazy, but I also understand it. If the president had lost the vote by just a couple percentage points, he could literally just go, oh no, I'm being overthrown, and then immediately get a second chance to try and run again. It wouldn't surprise me if that was actually the case, but because it doesn't surprise me, and it probably doesn't surprise you, it just really shows how incredibly screwed up the system is in Guinea-Bissau for that to be a totally realistic thing to guess. Yeah. And we're not the only ones to suspect that. Both Senegal's prime minister and Nigeria's former president have come out and said that they believe the ousting of Guinea-Bissau's president this week was staged. Now, they have not provided evidence of this yet at the time that I'm making this, which is on November 29th, 2025, but who knows? Maybe by the time this video releases in early December, things have changed. We can't really say. Nigeria's ex-PM, Goodluck Jonathan, who, by the way, I freaking love that name in the first place, would lead a team of election observers from the West African Elders Forum to Guinea Bissau and said the incident was, and I quote, not a coup. He instead described it as a ceremonial coup, questioning the events that preceded it and why it was Embaló who first announced his own overthrow. The latter would phone French TV station France 24 and said, and I quote, I have been deposed, end quote. Jonathan would go and contrast this with how other leaders in the region were ousted in recent coups, demanding that the results of the election be released so they could see just how close the polls really were. After all, Embaló has said he has survived multiple coup attempts during his time in office, though critics have previously accused him of fabricating crises in order to crack down on dissent. Really, anything is possible. And as for how the people of the country feel about it, well, most do not seem to really care, amazingly enough. The people of Guinea-Bissau are practically numb to it, and things are returning to normal, slowly but surely. Yes, people are unhappy, but unfortunately, this just seems to be part and parcel of living in Guinea-Bissau. This is not the first coup or coup attempt in most residents' lives. In fact, for many of its people, it's not even the fifth one. More are bound to happen, as the Mexico of Africa just struggles to find any solid ground to maintain an institution on. What will happen next, we normally could not say here on this channel, but I will bet you anything right now that the answer is going to be more coups. That is practically a guarantee that could be made. With that then, my friends, we're going to be ending things here today. That is where we currently are, and of course, if anything changes, we will do an update video talking about how we got there in the first place. My voice is starting to go. I think I'm getting sick after I just got back here from Japan. I've been gone for the last month, and this is really starting to hurt me now. Thank you all very much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. If you would like to join me at War of the Barons, I'm going to be leaving. Thank you all very much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm going to leave a link for War of the Barons that is down in the description, so you should definitely go and check that out. And also, I am leading trips to Croatia and Greece this summer, which I highly recommend that you go and click the links for that because, I spent a month in Japan with you all. It was a blast, and I cannot wait to do more of these. It is going to be so much fun. So click those links, join me, and let's go have an adventure together, my friends. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye, everyone.